everyone. So today I'll be going over Chapter 14, Social Cognitive Career Theory, also SCCT for short. So this presentation is meant to answer some of these questions. What is social cognitive theory? How does it explain career development and choice? And what counselors can do with this theory? So I'm hoping out of this presentation that you'll be able to identify and define the key components of social cognitive career theory and be able to understand and demonstrate the relationships between all the factors involved in the model. Finally, as always, we like to have an understanding of how cultural factors such as gender and race can impact our clients in our work, and so we'll be looking at how these factors impact career choice in the SCCT framework. And finally, I'd like for you to be able to at least identify what interventions can be utilized using the SCCT framework. So let's get started. Social cognitive career theory originates from the work of psychologist Albert Bandura. He is known for his research on motivation, aggression, and also he is the one who developed social learning, what is now called social cognitive theory. He's also particularly famous for something called the Bobo doll experiment. And in this study, he observed how children would treat a Bobo doll after they witnessed another child being rewarded or punished for being extra aggressive to the Bobo doll. This would be like things for punching or throwing the doll across the room. And so what he observed was that when children saw other kids being rewarded for more aggressive behavior towards the doll, they were more likely to engage in the same kind of behavior themselves with the Bobo doll. So through these types of studies, Bandura came up with social learning theory. And unlike other learning theories, such as operational conditioning, social learning theory claims that people learn by observing, imitating, and copying others. People learn not just by being rewarded or punished, but they also learn implicitly from watching someone else being rewarded or punished. So, social learning, again, social cognitive theory, looks at the interaction among the person, the environment, and their behavior. So, again, this is with the person being composed of their own thoughts, beliefs, and perceptions. So this model of understanding human behavior is shown in Bandura's triadic reciprocal interaction system. And that's quite a mouthful, so to break that down, the model is triadic because of its three components, and it's reciprocal because each of these components has an impact on each other. So we have personal factors influence our behavior influences the environment, and our environment influences our personal factors, and vice versa. Another major concept of Bandura's that we'll review later in this lecture is self-efficacy. And it's this term and this model that provided the basis for many studies on career choice and behavior. So, three founding researchers, Stephen Brown, Gail Hackett, and Robert Lent, went on to create social cognitive career theory. These researchers were mostly interested in looking at how self-efficacy affects factors that impact our academic and career interests. Together, they created a model that expanded on Bandura's model to include factors such as self-efficacy, outcome expectations, and goal selection. And their model shows how these interact to influence our achievements and choices of career. So here is the model that we'll be reviewing today in today's lecture. Now, I know this looks like a lot, but trust me, I'm going to break it down and explain each component of this model. And afterwards, we'll go over an example of what this model looks like in action. So let's start with the first three outer influences: personal inputs or factors, contextual influences that are proximal to the choice, and background contextual affordances. So, what are personal inputs or personal factors? Well, these, as described in the book, are predispositions. Predispositions are our attitudes or our personality or our tendencies to act in a certain way. Other personal inputs or qualities of an individual include their gender, their race, ethnicity, and also things like whether or not they have a disability or a medical condition. So, what are background contextual affordances? I like to look at these as background factors. These factors are what they call distal influences. These are factors that have occurred earlier in life that still have an impact on one's choice and or actions in the present. So something that happened in the past could be gender socialization. So how you were socialized as a child according to your gender can influence the choices that you make today. So contextual influences proximal to the choice, for shorthand we'll call them proximal influences. These are things or factors that occur or are present like right before you're going to make a choice. So they have more of an immediate impact on one's choices or behaviors. So let's explore these last two concepts a little bit further. Background and proximal contextual factors are distinct from one another. However, they do have a few things in common. Both types of contextual factors can act as barriers and supports to deciding to pursue a certain career path. However, again, what makes these different from each other is the quote-unquote distance from the choice. So an example of a background factor that can act as a barrier is socioeconomic status. So growing up in a family that doesn't have enough to eat can definitely impact your performance in school, your access to opportunities, and whether or not you'll develop high self-efficacy when it comes to going to college. So this is something that perhaps has happened in the past or is ongoing that is distant from your decision, let's say, to go to college, but it's still having an impact on you. So an example of a proximal barrier is more of an immediate concern, like the cost of tuition for going to university. This is something that can definitely and immediately impact your level of interest in attending a university. The examples of support also differ. A background factor, such as being a part of a family that encourages you to study and celebrates education, is something that's enduring and can start as early as, like, let's say preschool. So again, this is something that has happened in the past and is distant to the current decision you're making now, and yet it still has an influence. So an example of a proximal support is maybe you qualify for a scholarship, and so that will definitely, affect whether or not you're going to make the decision to pursue a college degree. So looking back at our model, let's go ahead and clear some of these arrows out of the way so we can see better. So you can see right here that the proximal contextual influences, they have like an immediate impact on, let's say, your interests or your goals and your actions. These factors act as what researchers call moderators, and these are things that can amplify or diminish the likelihood of you making of the likelihood of something occurring. So these contextual influences can increase the likelihood or decrease the likelihood that, let's say, your interests shape your goals, or let's say it can immediately impact and amplify whether or not your goals impact your actions. And so, what that would look like is, let's say you are really interested in going to an art school, and you're really passionate about art. So, if a contextual influence, let's say the amount of money you have to go to the college, is gonna can diminish or amplify how your interests impact your goals. So let's say I have a lot of money and I can go to whatever college I choose. Well, then I can definitely go ahead and pursue my interests. And so that will amplify how my interests impact my goals. But let's say I don't have enough money and my family needs me to, help support them. So my interest in art, it might have a diminished impact on my goals, because my goals are going to be based upon some of the contextual influences. My goals are going to be taking care of my family. So let's examine now the second level of the model. I like to call this section cognitive influences, because they mostly involve things like memories and perceptions. So, cognitive influences that impact career choice are self-efficacy, learning experiences, outcome expectations, and performance. Now, most of these terms are self-explanatory, except for self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is your perception or judgment of your ability to perform a specific task. A term they use in the literature for self-efficacy is that it is domain specific, and that means your level of self-efficacy can change depending on the domain you're looking at. So I could have a domain of math and a domain of art, and so my self-efficacy can vary across those two domains. So self-efficacy answers the question of, can I do this? While outcome expectations answer, what will happen if I do this? So while we're at it, outcome expectations come in three types. So there are physical outcomes, like I'll get a raise if I do my job well. There are social outcomes. Everyone at work will think I'm awesome if I do my job well. And there's self-evaluative outcomes, and so I'll think I'm awesome for doing my job well. So again, outcome expectations are what will happen if I do this, and self-efficacy is, well, can I do this? And as the book explains, self-efficacy is not an accurate estimate of one's ability to perform a specific task. For example, I can be making B's on all my math tests, and at the same time, I can have low self-efficacy. I'm feeling like I'm not good at math, and this can also affect my outcome expectations, where I think I'm going to flunk every test, even though in the past I've made B's. Truly, if I wasn't good at math, then I'd probably be failing and making F's. So finally, research shows that self-efficacy has a higher impact on our decisions to engage in an activity than outcome expectations. So even though we might know something good will happen as an outcome of an action, if we don't believe we can perform the task needed to get that outcome, then we're less likely to engage in an activity. So as you can see, it's kind of like self-efficacy is how you feel about something, and outcome expectations are what you know about it. Both self-efficacy and outcome expectations come together when it comes to making a decision. Before we go on to our next set of concepts, I wanted to point out the cyclical nature of this part of the model. As you can see, there's a loop between performance and to learning experiences. And so learning experiences help us develop our self-efficacy, and they influence our outcome expectations, our predictions. So outcome expectations and self-efficacy influence each other. They go back and forth, where our self-efficacy influences our outcome expectations, and our outcome expectations can influence our self-efficacy. So ultimately, all these factors, self-efficacy and outcome expectations, they influence our performance. Granted, outcome expectations have an indirect influence on performance because they go through self-efficacy to then have an impact on performance. Okay, so let's go back to our main model. So as you can see, self-efficacy and outcome expectations also influence interests, goals, and actions. Looking at the model, we can see the relationship between these three concepts as being fairly linear. What you're interested in, like your hobbies, your favorite subjects, your values, they influence the type of goals you set. And the types of goals you set influence and shape the actions you take. But keep in mind of those proximal factors that we looked at earlier, as these can also influence the relationships between our interests, goals, and actions. Again, as I mentioned earlier in the example of I want to go to art school, the contextual factors like the amount of money I have to go to college can influence whether or not I get to go to the art college of my choice, or whether or not I decide to pursue a different career that's going to allow me to make more money. So let's take a look at how SCCT models the development of interest. So it's actually very similar to the model we've been looking at so far. It involves the same components of self-efficacy, performance, and outcome expectations. It just has different pathways that lead to either interest or disinterest. So interest develops through, it develops in tandem with self-efficacy. High self-efficacy and positive outcomes expectations increase the likelihood that you're going to engage in activity. And the more you engage in activity, the better you get at it over time, usually. And ultimately, this good performance, this high performance, increases your self-efficacy and leads to a high interest. So the opposite can be said for disinterest. So where you can have any order of negative expectations, low performance, or low self-efficacy, all of these decrease the likelihood that you'll engage in an activity, and eventually you'll lose interest or avoid the activity. So again, it's important to not forget the personal and contextual factors that influence these factors. So these contextual factors and personal factors influence our interest in an indirect way, such as an example is whether a woman has an interest in being a mechanic. So due to an external process like gender socialization, she could receive negative messages about girls getting involved in quote-unquote man's work. Or maybe perhaps her family is not a good source of support for her interests when she tries to help her dad fixing the car, And he adds on to these negative experiences by telling her, I told you girls shouldn't mess with cars. Or maybe she doesn't have the opportunity to engage in mechanic related activities. This would be a more proximal influence because she doesn't engage in these activities because there are no programs offered to intermediate area. So these proximal and background factors can interfere with whether or not our interests develop over time. So, as we've learned so far, according to SCCT, there are many factors that can influence career choice and interests and behaviors that lead us to making the choices that we do in career. And so all of these factors interact and have influence on each other. So let's try to put all of this together. So keeping in mind that these background factors are present, let's see how these other factors interact with each other in action. I'll be using the example provided in the textbook to demonstrate. So here we have Sharon, a 16-year-old African American female who's currently a junior in a large public school in San Francisco. Now, Sharon, she does not like math. More specifically, she has low self-efficacy in math. She doesn't believe that she can learn math, and she has poor outcome expectations for her exams. So we have her self-efficacy, her low self-efficacy, and her outcome expectations for math are also low. And so these are going to diminish her interest in math. However, she does have an interest in singing. So this interest was fostered by her positive experiences in singing at church, which increased her expectations for singing well and also her self-efficacy in singing. So this causes her interest in singing to grow. And this increased interest causes her goals to be more focused on singing. So Sharon wants to become a famous singer like the next Beyonce. And so this dream or this goal influences the action she takes, such as attending singing lessons every week and totally neglecting her math homework. So the action she takes influences her performance. Sharon's singing has greatly improved, while her math scores have gone down. Finally, as she keeps having great performances in singing, this contributes to her learning experiences. And so it connects all the way to learning experiences. And so these experiences of doing well go back to influence her self-efficacy and outcome expectations about singing. And so after this, the cycle repeats again. Wash, rinse, and repeat. Now, you may be wondering, given some of the cultural factors Sharon being female and African American, what does SCCT research have to say about the impact of these factors of gender and culture? So, the textbook offers a pretty good summary of past research studies that look at gender and self-efficacy and career barriers faced by women. So, research on self-efficacy shows that there are differences between men and women. However, some of these findings are mixed. So, for example, one study found women tended to score lower on self-efficacy in traditionally non-female occupations. So this researchers have found is partly due to the negative impact of stereotypes, and what those stereotypes have on women seeking traditionally non-female occupations. However, when you compare the self-efficacy levels among men and women with similar occupations, then few gender differences were found. Something to note is that these studies were typically done on college students attending university. Other studies show that greater differences exist among uh, males and females who are younger and currently attending high school. So, as for barriers to certain careers, one study found that women faced more gender based discrimination in the workplace and also face an increased responsibility towards the family than men do. Another study found that women were more likely to report finances as being a barrier to uh, pursuing a career, and they reported this more so than did men. So ultimately, gender does seem to have an influence over career self efficacy as to whether or not you're likely to face certain barriers to career opportunities. So, there are a variety of studies included in this section in the chapter. As researchers have focused on individuals from a variety of cultures: Asian, African American, Mexican American, Latinx, Italian, Chinese, Appalachian, and many more nationalities and races were discussed in this section. So, rather than going into detail on each study, I just wanted to leave you with a list of the major takeaways from this section. So, studies have found that there is a positive relationship between cultural assimilation and non traditional career self efficacy. So, that's a high relationship. So, when I say positive relationship, I mean the more assimilated someone is into a particular culture, the higher their non traditional career self advocacy was. And I'm assuming that when they say cultural assimilation, they are looking at assimilation into Western culture. Next, racism is negatively associated with self efficacy and outcome expectations, and that is experiencing racism or being a victim of prejudice negatively impacts your self efficacy, and it negatively impacts your outcome expectation. And finally, parental support of minority students can act as a buffer to mitigate the impact of what students would see as perceived barriers. And it would be interesting to see how parental support impacts other factors, such as whether or not racism is associated, whether or not racism has a larger impact or not. So let's look at how we can apply social cognitive career theory to career counseling. Now, I'd love to tell you that there is some specific technique prescribed by SCCT, but to my knowledge, there is none. However, SCCT does provide a solid framework for how to conceptualize a client's thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and culture and family history, and all of these factors into one package to show you how they influence career choice. So much like cognitive behavioral therapy, the ultimate goal for counselors utilizing SCCT is to help the client make academic and career choices. And so they do this by helping them change their beliefs about themselves and their outlook on their outcomes and goals. So, how do we do this? So, if you're going to utilize SCCT in career counseling, consider the following questions when working with clients. So, what are your clients' outcome expectations? What are your clients' interests? And how do they relate to their goals and actions? Take a look at your client's self-efficacy. What is their self-efficacy when it comes to certain careers or career success? What does the client's self-efficacy, does it accurately uh, reflect or display their actual ability? Because let's say maybe Sharon was actually really good at math, and because she didn't have the self-efficacy, she didn't believe she was good, she didn't pursue a career in like mathematics or something like that. So it's also important to look at contextual factors. So these include background factors that have an influence on the client's views of certain careers. So things like culture or socialization or socioeconomic status. Also, be sure to take a look at what proximal factors are impacting your client currently. How are these impacting their ability to make and fulfill career goals? So let's look at how maybe you can target some of your interventions. Something I would suggest is maybe diagramming your client's career development using the SCCT model and teaching your client what impacts their career choices and how they do so. Provide a rationale for how you're conceptualizing the problem. Also, very much like CBT, provide opportunities for the client to build their self-efficacy. Provide them with the learning experiences. This could be having them engage in a particular activity in session, or encouraging them to engage in career-specific activities outside of session. So try to examine and challenge beliefs that hold your client back, and these include looking at their self-efficacy or looking at their outcome expectations. Also, explore possible solutions to those career barriers. This could be dealing with some of those proximal factors. For example, if I don't have enough money currently to go to college, maybe we can influence those proximal factors by looking for scholarships. So again, as you can see from these interventions, they all sound rather familiar to career counseling. However, they have a rationale in the SCCT model, and the SCCT model really is just an excellent framework for you to organize how you're going to target your interventions. On a final note, SCCT emphasizes the importance of social interactions when it comes to building self-efficacy and forming career choice. So, when working with clients, counselors should be aware of how their own internal biases or stereotypes influence how they act with a client, and how the way they act with a client can impact how the clients form their self-efficacy. Because again, this learning is a social process. So being aware of how these factors can impact your client is key for counselors to consider. Also, be aware of how contextual factors impact your clients, because this can also help you build your empathy towards them and negate some of those biases that you may or may not hold. So also be aware of how your own outcome expectations and values differ from your clients. Make sure you're supporting the clients in their goals and not your goals for the client. Well, it's good to instill hope in clients by providing accurate information about career options and making plans towards certain jobs or careers. Check with yourself to see if this is something that is helping your client form their own goals, and it's not you that's taking control and leading the session. Well, that about wraps up this presentation, but before you go, please take a moment to fill out this feedback survey. I'll also try to leave a link in the description. But as you may know, I'm currently in the doctoral program, and I'm learning how to be an effective counselor, educator, and supervisor. And part of this learning process is just learning how students respond to presentations we give. And so it really helps us to learn and grow as educators when we get this feedback. So if you could please take a moment to um, fill out this survey, it really helps me to know your opinion. And also, my cat, Precious, he gets a belly rub every time someone answers my survey. So he really wants you to fill out that survey so he can get all the belly rubs. So go ahead, make his day and, give him a belly rub. I hope this presentation was helpful for your learning, and until we meet again in some way, shape, or form, I wish you and your loved ones good health and take care.